in the neighborhood and just stopped by because this was a great restaurant to have lunch or dinner at. They then went back to Rainier, Washington, and looked for that restaurant, and it didn't exist. There were no modern cars, no antique cars, and no restaurant. So Gary investigated what happened to that restaurant, and he found that the original restaurant they went to had not been there for decades. And the time that it was closed down was the time that those antique cars were seen by he and his children. So that takes it obviously out of Gary's mind. It was a shared experience.
Okay.
Of essentially going back to the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does show that there may be more than just the subjective experience, because what we have in dualism is everything has an opposite. So you have, for example, you have the concept of the real, let's not call it the real experience, but let's call it the objective experience and the subjective experience. And you, having been an attorney, a lawyer, and worked with witnesses, you see the objective versus the subjective over and over again. But it's possible that it's not just dual. There could be many more than just those two possibilities.
Now, wait a minute, wait. I read this the other way. He had, I believe it was at least two children in the car with him. So those are three individuals who remembered the original restaurant with the antique car shows. And then all three of them or more went from Gig Harbor to Rainier, Washington, and all experienced not finding either the restaurant that was there or any evidence that had been torn down recently or those cars. So that's enough for evidence.
Right.
In other words, it wasn't his subjective experience. It was the whole family's, and they reported the same thing.
Okay, and I'm not saying that they would have had separate experiences. Okay, they had the shared experience. But I'm saying it's the shared experience that they had. The question is, and of course this is kind of a silly question, but if there was some way to interview other people who were in the area where they were and ask them what their experience was, then you would finally find out whether there was a difference between the two experiences. Right now, we can't do that.
There could have been, for example, an antique car show in the present, and then both that was shut down and the restaurant was torn up. But when Gary investigated it, that wasn't the case. The restaurant had been there decades ago, you see?
Well, yeah, and I'm not suggesting either one. I'm suggesting, how about if they really were in a different time line, period. If they're in a different timeline.
I think they were. I think there was enough evidence to hang our hat on and say, if the Anderson family experienced the restaurant, experienced the antique cars, and then investigated and found out that the restaurant had not been torn down recently, that was reliable prima facie evidence that they had time slipped into the past while stopping there for lunch or dinner. And it was a multiplicity of family members who knew each other and were on very good terms with each other. So it was I think that's a very reputable time slip.
Okay.
Because it was proved by three or more who agreed and investigated the very restaurant they had stopped at, you see?
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to argue it.
And there was evidence they were in the past not with the good luck of seeing a very interesting antique car demonstration of some kind, like a contest among antique car models. But there wasn't a car show. They were just cars from that time period that were being seen, because for that short period where they stopped off the road and sought lunch or dinner at that restaurant, they were in the past. I mean, that's my interpretation. I think
Yeah.
Harry would agree with that.
Yeah, I do. I have no problem with it. I was suggesting that if essentially what we're talking about is the way that it really is, which is that there are many timelines and people either singularly or as a group can skip around from one timeline to another for some, we don't know why. You're suggesting it had to do with something about radioactivity. It's a possibility. But all I'm saying is it could be just that there are many timelines and they do not have to necessarily have anything to do with the past or the present. They can have to do with anything.
Well, let's hold
Yeah, okay.
the explanations I have for them. I was hoping to do so. Number 4, that was number 3. Number 4 was told to me almost 30 years ago by a man who was a dentist in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. I don't remember exactly what town it was. It may have been Reseda, it may have been Sherman Oaks. He was appearing on different radio shows like Coast to Coast AM about time travelers, Dr. Bruce Goldberg. You probably had him on Timeless Voyager. But I'll try to do justice to the story that Bruce told to me almost 30 years ago, not that long ago. It was sometime probably after 1995, but before I left Southern California in 2003 to resume my legal career up here in Washington. What Bruce reported, I think, so I'm going to give a caveat to Dr. Bruce Goldberg that I've tried to do a good telling of his experience, but I apologize if I've gotten this a little wrong, but I think I have it right. What he said is he wanted to see the Grand Canyon in like the 1940s. He finally got the opportunity in the 1970s or 80s. But then when he developed the film from his trip to the Grand Canyon, much later in life than he had originally intended to go, like he wanted to go in his teen years, and he finally got there like when he was 45 or 55. When he developed the film, it was of the past. Now, this gets a little bit more twisty. How the hell did that happen? All of the cars were 1940s vintage in the photographs. But when he did visit the Grand Canyon, he said to me, I think this is what Bruce Goldberg said to me. Andy, when we went to the Grand Canyon, it was still the present. Why then were the photographs taken from a much earlier time? In fact, the very time when he originally wanted to go to see the Grand Canyon. So I think this is starting to indicate what may be going on. So I'll say it now, which is there seems to be some aspect to evinced reality that indicates we're living in a self-organizing universe. So if, for example, let's say we have a desk near a window and we think about a particular person and we haven't seen them for, let's say, 40 years, and then they walk past the window, is it a coincidence, or is it just that there's actually a kind of a numerical explanation of what events happen, but it's just too complex for us to model mathematically? The self-organizing universe of Stanislav Grof, as it were. I had one synchronicity in which 4 reminders of the solar aviator Paul McCready happened to me in one morning that were unrelated. In other words, the universe was informing me of Paul McCready, almost telling me, write a book about Paul McCready, the solar aviator, the creator of the Gossamer Albatross, the Gossamer Condor. But Bruce was basically not sharing a time slip, but a a form of time slipping that just happened with his photographs. So, and that also begs the question, are we having a random reality, or are we in a matrix that's being programmed and fed to us? So, for example, one possible explanation for Bruce Goldberg's was he was supposed to enjoy the experience of going to the Grand Canyon when he was in the 1940s, and the universe still put that in his possession decades later. Because I don't really find any other explanation for the Bruce Goldberg story here. The fourth time slip that we're looking at, which is the Bruce Goldberg pretty iconic story of, well, he wanted to go there earlier, but all that survived of that wish were the photographs. And Bruce, did you maybe go to the Grand Canyon when you were in your teens and forget it? And you confused your photographs from then with the recent trip? And he said, absolutely not. It was one of the disappointments in my life up to that stage. I had always wanted to go at a time when the photographs of cars there at the rim of the Grand Canyon would have been 1940s era vintage automobiles, but I know I never did. I finally got there like in 1975 or something. And I take a look at the photographs and it's from the past. So there is a lot of weirdness going on regarding time slips and what's really happening to the time-space continuum. And that I'll ultimately give my own explanation. One more, I don't have the permission of the experiencer, but I'll just characterize the person involved because she did not give me permission to use her name back when I interviewed her on 2016 or 17. She was a young actress, about 20, in Los Angeles, trying to make it in Hollywood, film or television, multi-talented, was also a singer, a storyteller, a comedian. In fact, received advice from the great Marlon Brando that she do everything, not be limited to one craft. And she was going home to her apartment in Hollywood, and she was struck by another automobile and spun out. She didn't really have a crash. She was spun by the other automobile. The paramedics helped her get out of her car, which was not really terribly injured. And she went into a woman's apartment right adjacent to the crash. She noticed that the woman was friendly and helpful and healthy, but she was wearing kind of a tie-dye blouse from the 60s and sandals from the 60s. So she didn't know whether she was a contemporary woman born, she was born in the late 70s. So this person would have been born in the late 80s or late 90s, or not born, but in the late 90s when the crash occurred. And she said the woman let her come in her apartment and call her boyfriend to tell him that she'd been in this crash. She went back the next Monday, I believe it was, with some flowers and some candy for the lady, intending to thank her for letting her call her boyfriend after her crash, and also tell her boyfriend that she was okay, even though she had been spun out during the event. She's sure she went back to the same apartment, and yet the supervisor or landlord said, "Ma'am, nobody has lived in this apartment for 30 years. In fact, I'll show you. We use it to hold up, to hold people's possessions. Kind of like a storage unit in the complex." Now, this one I think is a little weaker because it was only experienced by her. She can't trace the lady who was supposedly living there. And this is an example we have to be really careful about time slips. If she was spun out in her car, bad enough for paramedics to rescue her from this accident. I believe all that may have happened is she may have gone back to the wrong apartment because the manager or supervisor of the apartment complex didn't take a lengthy explanation from her about what she was remembering. He just said, "Ma'am, there is no such lady here. We use this as storage." But still, it's more proof that time slips are probably occurring, because it looks like the lady who helped her was from the 1960s, and this incident was during the late 90s. And she is adamant about the fact, or at least she was back when she contacted me 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, that it was the very apartment where she had walked in and called her boyfriend. And it had a telephone. The lady was living there. It was all, modern equipment and everything in the apartment. It was lived in. The lady who was helping her was living there. But then, of course, the manager said it couldn't have been, ma'am, because we've used this for storage for decades, and opened it up and showed her. And instead of that lady and her possessions being in that apartment, it was just everybody's random stuff that they wanted placed in storage and not in their unit. So those are the 5 time slips I wanted to share. And I wanted to share that last one to demonstrate sometimes people can be wrong, not from mental illness, but because of the subjective experiences to something that has just happened to them. If she was spun out having the back of her car nicked by another car, it was just like a spinning type experience. She may have misperceived what apartment she was going back to. Okay. So I don't know ultimately what happened to this person. It could have been a time slip, or it could have been psychological confusion of where she was when she tried to go back to that apartment and give the nice lady some flowers and candies for helping her. But time slips are definitely happening. Now, what could explain it? I believe that we should be concerned about the fact that our civilization has detonated, I think it's at least 2,200 atomic bombs and nuclear bombs, thermonuclear detonations. I think that the significance of time slips is completely underrated as just a curious event in the paranormal, something that makes sort of interesting stories, and may literally be critical information we're getting that by exploding nuclear weapons, we are damaging the time-space continuum. If we are, and I think there's evidence that we are, because these events seem to have proliferated with the proliferation of nuclear weapons, we may be upsetting and permanently injuring the time-space continuum itself. The time-space continuum that we rely on so that future follows past and not the other way around. I mean, because without quantum access-based technology, we should not have experiences where event follows the cause. But as we've discussed in some of my former appearances with you and others, that's what quantum access does. In other words, time travel causes us to experience the event before the time is experienced. That is replacing linear causation with what I call circular causation. Okay? Now, we don't want to do that at random. We can tolerate that when we're using quantum access time travel devices because we know what we're doing. But to accidentally put the event before the cause to mass disaster. And I really want to blow the whistle on this possibility because these time slips, my investigation reveals, are proliferating. Who would want to get up when they're 50 and find themselves 25?
I would. I would.
Yeah, I would.
I'm sorry.
How would we manage reality?
Right.
Dealing with the event
Exactly.
before the cause.
No, you're saying exactly what I was saying, like a while back. But yeah, I mean, we're looking for a certain amount of information that follows our perception, which is that it first there's a past, then there's a present, and then there's a future. We want it to be that way.